Hello and good afternoon, evening, morning, depending on where you are. I'm J. Stephen Morrison. I'm Senior Vice President here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., where I direct the Global Health Policy Center. We're thrilled today to be able to host Yanzhong Huang, the author of the recently released book, Toxic Politics, China's Environmental Health Crisis and Its Challenge to the Chinese State. It's published in mid-October. It's a great opportunity for us today to have a conversation about it. I'll explain a little bit more in a moment on how we're going to go about that. We're joined also by my colleague Jude Blanchette, who is the Freeman Chair in China Studies and Senior Fellow at CSIS. Glad to have you with us, Jude. And Yanzhong, thank you so much for taking the time to come celebrate the launch of the book and talk about it.
Thank you, Steve.
So Yanzhong is, let me just introduce you. Yanzhong is a professor at the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University and a senior fellow in global health at the Council on Foreign Relations. We've had a long-standing friendship and set of collaborations going back many years. He's kindly agreed to be part of our Commission on Strengthening America's Health Security. We'll be doing some more work on China in that regard in the next year, 2 years. We're very grateful for that. We've had a chance to appear at each other's institutions over the past few years and to cooperate in some of our conferencing and the like. And I think we'll be doing much more of that as we look forward. We've asked Yanzhong to open up by telling us a bit about the genesis of this book. Why did he choose to spend 5 important years in his career putting this book together? What was the genesis? What motivated him to embrace this topic? We know that Liz Economy put out a great book, The River Runs Black, 2004. I remember reading that book and being very impressed. So you're coming in a long line of tradition on this particular topic. And I saw that Liz played an important role in helping you with this, which is great. So we've asked Yanzhong to answer that question, but also go beyond that in terms of telling us about the core argument. How did he land at that core argument, and what is it? What is it that is the major thesis that runs through this? After we've had that portion of the program, we're going to talk about what this means for China's governance and have a little bit more in-depth discussion. And then Jude's going to lead that segment of our program and has a number of questions that we will talk through. We're going to try and keep this lively and interactive, conversational. We're welcoming those in our audience to submit through the website questions or comments, and we'll integrate those as we can into our discussion. The third segment of our program will look at the question of what does this mean when we look at the COVID-19, the advent of the pandemic and the state's response to that and the overarching response to health security matters. We're very advantaged here because this is the area that Yanzhong has the greatest credibility and standing in this whole issue in terms of understanding the health sector. The Global Health Policy Center at CSIS has struggled at different times to do more work on environmental health. And so we were delighted and excited to be able to do this because this is, in my mind, the most important place to be talking about environmental health is China. So Yanzhong, thank you so much for being with us. Jude, thank you. I want to thank Amit Mandavili from CSIS, from my staff, in helping put this all together, and John Montz and Tara Neal for their help in producing this today. So over to you, Yanzhong.
Well, thank you, Steve, for that very generous introduction. I'm very honored to speak here today. And as both a former visiting fellow of the CSIS, the Freeman Chair of China Studies, and also as a member of the advisory expert advisor, is that advisory board of the CSIS Commission on Strengthening American Health Security. So glad to be here. Let me share my screen here. Okay. Okay. So let me just, okay. So in the beginning of the conversation, Steve asked me to basically introduce how and what motivated me to write this book. Well, this book project started in 2013, when pollution, especially the smog, suddenly became, headlines in Chinese media. If you may recall, by January 2013, the readings of PM 2.5 that was considered the most harmful type of air pollutant reached 40 times the maximum level allowed by the World Health Organization, or WHO. Right? There were also these reports about the water pollution in China, then food safety issues, the formal recognition of hundreds of the so-called cancer villages, the communities where rates of cancer are unusually high. So that sort of noted my interest to write on environmental health issues in China. But there is another reason, as a political scientist by training, I want to write on this topic, is that I want to use this sort of like a springboard to examine China's state capacity, because in all those discussions, debates on China's rise, the most studies tend to highlight China's economic prowess, military buildup, as well as its ability to project its international influence, but few seems to pay adequate attention to another important dimension of state power. That is the state capacity to extract and mobilize resources, to provide public goods and services, to have its claim to rule involuntarily or willingly accepted by its people, and to enforce rules and regulations, policies across its entire territory. So the environmental health issues and China's response actually serve as a springboard, or in a way also a litmus test to examine China's state capacity. So that is basically the two reasons that drove me to write on this book. And certainly what you could say, we have the environmental health issues well documented, in other in other countries, especially those the countries like the UK, the United States, and Japan. But if you compare their experience with China, I found the Chinese experience is actually quite unique, right, in terms of the scope, in terms of severity, in terms of complexity, in terms of timing, right? If you look at the scope of China's environmental health crises, right, we know that unlike many Western countries, where pollution is limited by locality and duration, China actually has found air pollution to be a nationwide and sustainable threat, right? You might recall, right, in the spring, actually in the winter 2013, right, this smog, how they affected the 800 million people over a span of 540,000 square miles. Right? And then there's this issue of severity, right? The pollution in some places is so bad, right? It went off the standard scale, right? Even the worst polluted American cities would rank, among those with the best air quality in China. This is how the U.S. journalist James Fallows say, but no one now lives alive has experienced anything similar in North America or Europe, except in the middle of a forest fire or volcanic eruption. And then, right, there's the issue of complexity, right? We have heard the London fog, we have heard the Los Angeles smog, but what the Chinese call the wumai or health is actually a mix of both, so that actually really sort of represent a big challenge, to the Chinese state. If we further consider that, when people, their prosperity grows, right? These people, now they value good health, beyond the basic earnings. So you actually found, this gap between the popular expectations, and the capacity of the state to fulfill their expectations actually has also significantly expanded, right? And finally, there's the issue of timing, right? If you look at the US, like the environmental problems, they did not face a major environmental crisis in its pre-World War II emergence as a superpower, and China does not enjoy such a luxury, right? So its enormous environmental health problems represent a major challenge also to China's global ambitions, right? So in the book, I basically focus on 3 types of environmental health challenges, right? Air pollution, water pollution, soil contamination, and food. Well, this is associated with another major challenge in China, the food safety, right? And that Cancer Village actually epitomized the environmental health, challenges the country is now facing, right? China now has more than 351, cancer villages. I think that's a very conservative estimate, and it is extremely hard actually to determine the level of contribution of pollution into a particular cancer in a given location. That make it also just addressing those challenges, a major issue in the country. And what we talk about in the book, the health consequences of pollution, then there's a special another chapter we discussed the economic, social, political, and foreign policy implications. So if you look at the pollution's impact on national economy, right? If we measure it using the value of a statistical life, again, when people, their prosperity, their standards of living increase, their expectations also are actually changed. Right now, they value things, the good health, more than ever. Right? I have been, when I was doing field work in China, I was heard how my mom, told me that story, that how, this old people in this village, say, now the life is getting better. I don't want to die. So that defined, if you use that Thomas Schelling's, this concept of value of a statistical life, or VSL approach to estimate how much people are willing to pay to reduce the mortality risk, you find actually China could lose up to 18% of GDP if we include also the cost of premature death, but also the cost of non-fatal illness. And certainly, the percentage could be even higher if we consider also the losses associated with water and soil pollution. And for China, but it takes time actually in terms of the policy to address the crises. The government did not launch an all-out war on pollution until 2013, 2014. So what I found in the book is that this murky and sometimes exclusive authoritarian system has not prevented the social forces, international actors, from influencing policy making in China. The U.S. Embassy, for example, played a very important role in the democratization of the pollution data and the push, the environmental issues higher on the government agenda. And then the social forces too, right? When people, learned that this PM 2.5, how is such a major health concern, they have launched this grassroots campaign, actually to take this air quality monitoring into their own hands. That actually this public outcry actually sort of pushed the government, to take actions on the environment. So this is on the society side. Then if you look at the government side in terms of the policy implementation efforts, the government indeed has, invested tremendously, in terms of boosting transparency and accountability, by introducing some even new policy instruments, such as environmental supervision talks, where you have the Ministry of Environmental officials, summon a local government official, to point out your environment quality in your location is too bad. You got to fix it. Right? But this kind of new efforts to improve accountability, as well as other the instruments like party administration shared responsibility, indeed helped improve the government accountability in addressing the environmental health concerns. There's certainly also other efforts. We are going to talk about this increasing central authority, the improved interdepartmental coordination, especially during a campaign against the pollution in 2016, 2017, when the central state, mobilized, there's the more than like 6,000, inspectors, and dispatch them nationwide, to monitor the implementation or enforcement of the pollution control policies, and then you have also, that since 2012, when President Xi, became the actual leader of this country, right? That this rapid centralization of political power sort of recreated this Maoist sort of bandwagon politics. When you have all these influential political resources concentrated in one person, you have the local officials basically jump onto his bandwagon to show their early and enthusiastic support of his favorite policy agenda. That was facilitated by those efforts, trying to institutionalize and routinize those policy instruments introduced during the policy campaigns. Actually helped, right, bring down the level of pollution. In fact, between 2013 and 2018, we have seen the PM 2.5 dropped by 46%, from 72 micrograms per cubic meter in 2013 to 39 in 2018. That was actually this figure shows this such a drop, right, at both the national and the regional level, right? The average PM 2.5 concentration, dropped, right? And I also used the U.S. missions data in China, right? They have until recently we had the 5, right, the embassies and the consulates, right, in China. So in these 5 cities, they also show the overall drop in terms of percentage of days, with mean average PM 2.5 level higher than 75, which is considered like a polluted days. So you've seen also on average, the overall drop of the pollution days. But the caveat is that, this progress of pollution control remain uneven nationwide. In some cities, actually it increased, right? There is also an increase in the concentration of other pollutants, like ozone, right? In fact, during the same period of time, the ozone level actually increased by 17%. Right? Most of this improvement, if you look at the Beijing, even though there's a significant improvement in air quality, right? Most of this improvement occurred in the summer. If you look at the percentage winter days with bad air quality in the city between 2009 and 2016, you don't see much significant improvement. In fact, beginning 2014, I actually saw a slight increase of the bad air quality, right? And then if you also look at the the steel production in China, which is considered also a major contributor of pollution in the country, right? Actually, after steel production peaked in 2014 and dropped for 2 consecutive years, it actually has risen again in 2017, right? If you look at this, the steel output between 2001 and 2019, right? It dropped, right? 2015, 2016, but then increased. Right now, the level of steel output increased to an even higher level in 2019. But so is the level of the coal production of consumption. But even though the share of the coal, the total energy mix actually dropped, right, below like 60%. But the level of the coal production consumption, since 2016 actually increased again, right? And certainly the COVID-19, the economic recovery threatened to wear away this past gains in pollution control, because the local governments want to recoup their losses associated with the outbreak. So you have seen how more construction permits actually were issued for coal-fired power plants in China in the first half of this year than in 2018 or 2019. In fact, according to a study, by May 2020, the concentration of the 4 major air pollutants, including PM 2.5, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and ozone, all returned to or exceeded the monthly levels recorded in 2019. So what does this study, this case, tell us, right? We know certainly what this environmental degradation in China has not only brought a wider range of diseases and other health problems than previously thought, it has also taken a heavy toll on Chinese society, the economy, and the polity, right? And since 2012, the government has indeed enacted new laws, policies, regulations, and action plans to tackle the pollution problem. It has, in doing so, introduced a number of new policy instruments, seeking to align the bureaucratic incentives with central policy goals, right? But the progress, as we said, remains uneven. The health benefits of pollution thus far remains limited, and mixed, and the single-minded pursuit of pollution control, has, and this is not discussed in the presentation, but it's covered in the book, and actually incurred unintended and undesirable outcomes on other policy fronts. So basically, what that study reveals a state that is, both remarkably resilient and fundamentally flawed. And that finding, I believe, has profound implications for China's future, both domestically and internationally. So with that, I'm going to stop there.
Thanks so much, Yanzhong. I should have said at the outset, this is a terrific book and a really important contribution to a very important issue set. I'm going to ask Jude to open up our discussion side here. Jude, over to you.
Great, thank you, Steve, and thanks for the opportunity to do some co-piloting with you today. Yanzhong, just want to echo some of the comments that Steve made to say that I just think this is an utterly imperative book for anyone to read who is thinking about the big issues right now about China's trajectory in the 21st century, the prospects for the Xi administration to succeed in its great project to reforge and remake the Chinese state. And of course, as something Steve knows well in his work, that what happens in China has, whether intended or not, profound implications for the rest of the world. And so I would say for any student of China's trajectory, Toxic Politics is just essential reading. I wanted to ask you a few questions looking at this from really what the core of the analysis is on, which is the particularities and behavior of China's decision-making, policy-making, and regulatory process. As you said in your opening, this is an important case study for thinking through and analyzing the way that the Chinese state and political system responds to problems as they emerge. And I want to come back around at the end of my questions to what you just said on your conclusion, which is it's remarkably resilient and fundamentally flawed. And gosh, I wish we had more of that kind of clear, objective thinking about China, because as you know, in DC, we alternate between one or the other pole, which is China's, its political system can plan 40,000 years into the future. And on the other side, it's feet of clay and it's going to collapse at any moment. And of course, neither of those analysis is correct. But I wanted to start with a question on the reforms or the restructurings under the Xi Jinping administration. And external observers, and I think a lot of media coverage has really focused on this one word of centralization, that essentially after 4 decades of allowing significant lower level autonomy to cadres to solve problems, that the Xi administration has really clawed back decision-making up into Beijing. And indeed, in many ways, as you write eloquently about, to solve some of these significant problems that China is facing on the environmental front. But of course, that's come at the expense of flexibility and autonomy at the local level. So I wanted to hear if you could unpack your analysis a little bit more on how is this central versus local tension playing out now that Beijing is trying to assert more authority and control? Is this in fact helping to achieve some of the environmental outcomes that China wants, or is this getting in the way of local level responses to some of the environmental challenges?
Great, thank you, Drew. One of the challenges, right, in China is the policy implementation, right, is that there's tensions between the central state and the local state, right? So this is as a saying, that the policy would not be honored beyond the Zhongnanhai, right, the central compound, right? So when Xi Jinping took over, right, one of his, I think, major efforts, right, is to re-centralize central control, as a way to ensure, that the local governments, the bureaucrats, that implement the preferred policy in a faithful and skilled manner. Right, so this is the period in terms of the enforcing of the environmental policies concerned, right? That we saw this introduction of all these major policy instruments, including like centralized, the environmental supervision, the party administration, the co-responsibility system, the river chiefs system, trying to also sort of enhance the central control. And certainly, when you have all this power concentrated in a superordinary actor, right? It basically changed the incentive structure of the local governments. They had strong incentives, to as we said, jump onto the leaders' bandwagon to show their enthusiastic support. So this brazen, food dragging, the failure to comply with government policies, is rare, but that, as you just suggested, that also deprives the local, autonomy and flexibility in policy implementation. So, this is a time, now we have seen how this discussion on so-called the lazy governance, this essentially is about local policy inaction, right? The basic local leaders, local government officials have few incentives to launch policy initiatives. We're going to talk about that later when with Steve, on this COVID response. That how basically local government officials now no longer have that the incentive to launch any meaningful, important policy initiatives. It also encouraged, right, that any particular right? There's the policy instruments being like the favored approach, like this what we call 一刀切, right? Or cookie cutter or one size fit all approach, right? In the campaigns, basically local government officials have no interest, to adopt any targeted, like interventions, approaches that consider the actual local conditions. It's just like they launched this cookie cutter approach. For example, environmental the pollution control. When they are asked to get rid of these so-called scattered, polluted, chaotic small industrial firms, they are not going to make any distinctions on whether that firms actually cause much pollution or not. Instead you have seen, basically what this is all this, a lot of those, the small businesses, produce little pollution, also are asked to shut down. So it's just this is the example, how this a kind of centralization of political control and actually could cause unintended and even undesirable consequences at the local level.
Earlier this year at the National People's Congress meeting, many of us were pleasantly surprised when they did not announce an annual growth target, GDP growth target, which I think almost universally was praised as a positive step. The idea, and again, you write about this throughout the book, the idea that a target on economic growth or GDP growth was a performance metric for cadres, but of course that then pushed them to make decisions that prioritized growth over other public health and environmental considerations. So I wanted to ask you about the implications for environmental outcomes and governance if this holds and China has essentially announced we're going to use the COVID-19 growth slowdown as a cover or approximate cause to do away with a long despised growth target. Asking the question somewhat flippantly, does this mean now that local level cadres are unencumbered to pursue the public good? What will they be measured on now that growth is no longer seen as a primary measuring stick?
Yeah, great question. I think for as far as environmental protection is concerned, right, eliminating the specific, these annual economic growth targets, I think it's a good thing, in terms, that it may change the incentive structure so that they pay more attention or devoted more energy to environmental protection, and provided that many of those measures are institutionalized, many of those environmental protection measures institutionalized and routinized, that they might actually change the local bureaucrats, government officials' behavior, just like what this population control policy has been doing in terms of internalizing people's behavior. Nowadays, even though in 2016, the government lifted that the one child per couple policy, the people still, was reluctant to have more than one child. So that just shows in the authoritarian state, if you have this government perseverance, on a particular policy, this environmental protection target is actually achievable. But in the meantime, that the problem is that even though they no longer have this annual economic targets, economic growth remains very important, in the leaders' policy agenda, when you talk about the China's this national rejuvenation, it hinges upon China's ability to significantly increase the economic power. That is where actually the annual economic growth remains important. In the meantime, given that this legitimacy base, has not been changed, but it's in a way performance based. It's not rely on rule of law, right? So you still, for the party state, still value significantly, but the issue of social and political stability, right? And to ensure social political stability, then you still have strong incentive to promote, to sustain high economic growth at the local level, because, right, the slowdown of the economic development, what means more unemployment, and that would be considered actually a major factor contributing to local social and political stability, which is still, as we know, the buzzword, right, in Chinese officialdom. So that the dilemma between pursuing environmental protection and pursuing economic growth continues to be there. Even though there's some Chinese government economists that believe, this theory of the environmental Kuznets, this hypothesis, that when the economic growth continued, right, eventually you're going to see the pollution level drops. But this might be just their wishful thinking.
I have a million questions I could ask you, Yanzhong, but I want to maybe bring in Steve at this point, just looking at the clock and knowing that we've got this other really profound topic to discuss, which is mapping on your diagnosis here of how the Chinese state responds and anticipates public health and environmental questions, and now mapping this onto arguably one of the biggest public health stories of this generation, which is COVID-19. So Steve, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jude. Before we go to COVID-19, can I just ask you one question about the cancer villages? We have something like that in the United States, and it's been examined. A famous sociologist at UC Berkeley, Arlie Russell Hochschild, lived off and on for 5 years in Louisiana and Bayou country, very high cancer rates, and wrote a groundbreaking book, came out 4 or 5 years ago, called Strangers in Their Own Land. And I raise this because what she discovered was that people knew they lived in the cancer villages. They knew this, but they had somehow, and as a matter of political culture, come to terms with this. And they were distrustful of government. They were cynics about what could be done to fix them. They wanted to preserve their personal freedom at almost any cost. They didn't want interference, and it was how she came about trying to explain this in our society, where this had become a long-standing problem. Is there something going on in these villages and in the popular culture in terms of the acceptance, or somehow it's not just an authoritarian repressive thing, but it's a compact. It's some sort of compact where people agree to live with this for other reasons. Is that true? I mean, I remember reading Hochschild's book and trying to puzzle over this, and she was very convincing that this was political culture, and it evolved over time, and it was very hard to crack.
Okay, good question. I think cancer villages in China, it's a phenomenon that is unique to China. First of all, it's located mainly in eastern China. It's more river-basin wide phenomenon. And in the meantime, in terms of people's response to this phenomenon, especially when you talk about people living in those villages, well, they have an incentive, that to take actions, as petition the government to take actions on these issues. But in the meantime, what they also have themselves, have these incentives, especially after the government, that already have taken some measures, to fix the problem. They want to, they sort of downplay, the risk posed by the cancer villages, because they don't want, their village to be stigmatized. In China, certainly, but just like there's AIDS, the villages, right? You have a incentive not to be stigmatized, because that could have implications on whether your sons could find wives, whether your produce would be welcomed in other the villages, the markets, and for the local governments too, right? That they have incentive actually not to sort of make those cancer villages visible, right? Because that could also affect their capacity to attract foreign investment. So that this is the very sort of complex phenomenon. I think there's a Chinese professor. He actually wrote a book, especially talking about the cancer village phenomenon.
Thank you, Yanzhong. Let's shift to the COVID response. Now, you're very knowledgeable, and you've been tracking this since the very beginning, and have written and spoken about this. The story is not fully told or understood as to how things unfolded. We still don't know the true origin of this. There's still problems, gaps in terms of the decision process. We know that there were different layers of government that led to a critical stall of 7-8 weeks during which the spread happened. But we also know that in terms of the response, the clampdown was extraordinary and unprecedented. 150 million people put under the most strict set of lockdown provisions for 70 days. And then half of the country put under some fairly serious form of restriction, and it worked to the degree that it brought the infection rate down to very manageable levels, and they've had the capacity of chasing down outbreaks in isolation and containment quarantine. Now, it's been brutal. It's carried a heavy price, but it's also paved the way for the Chinese government to not be free of this disease, but be functional and be back, and to have economic growth restored, and then to begin to try to compensate for the reputational damage that they have earned externally as well as internally, have taken up the vaccine quest and the nationalism associated that with a grand amount of energy and drama. 5 vaccines in phase 3 trials right now. They've begun all these external partnerships. They're flooding the marketplace in many areas with vaccines and the like. So they've turned this in a very interesting way. The story around COVID-19 suggests to me something different than what you've described. What you've described to me looks like a government awakens to a problem. It mobilizes, it attempts to move this forward, but it can't pull it off because of deep innate dysfunctionalities in governance, mixed incentives. And so it has mixed results, but the accumulating failure, as you argue, eats away at the rise of the country, hinders it, harms the economy, holds its back, keeps alive the risk that it'll slide into middle country status, middle income status. It creates doubt about its leadership potential at a global level and national level. Is the story of COVID in China a different kind of story? And if so, why? Or is it really something, when you look a little more deeply, it looks quite similar in some respects, or consistent with what you have identified as the dynamic in environmental degradation and the effects on society, economy, governance? Over to you, Yanzhong.
Well, thank you, Steve. Well, certainly when we compare, right, the environmental crises, to this COVID outbreak, we're talking about two different kinds of disasters, right? The environmental issue is basically a slow disaster, right? But the COVID outbreak, this is what the acute, right? The disease outbreak event. So this is the difference between the two. But if you look at the government response, right, the pattern, we could identify a lot of parallel, right, between the two, right? Essentially, right, in terms of policy response, right? First, you have seen the issue being ignored, even denied, then you have seen this decisive action, right, from the central state, especially when the central leaders, realize this is a big problem, right? This is the then they can basically unleash, a torrent of state actions. This is we saw right in Wuhan, when President Xi ordered the lockdown on January 22nd. Very soon, but you had the lockdown extended, to other cities in Hubei. Eventually, the whole China become like a quarantine center, right? So, we talk about two types of power, right? The first is despotic power, and the second is infrastructural power. Well, definitely, the despotic power, the policy autonomy, can be magnified and significantly increased when the state elites, right, are managing, a perceived crisis. And when you look at the infrastructural power, that is the state capacity to have its rule based on this policy, right, to transmit it to the lowest level and get implemented, right? That move is facilitated by this rapid centralization of political power too, right? That generated strong incentives for government officials actually to comply with the central order, right? Essentially, what this is we have all heard these examples of how over a span of only a few days, well, in January, February, the country is able to complete the building of 2 new hospitals, right? In Wuhan, that each could accommodate 1,000 severe, the patients with severe cases, right? But if you look at also the approach they have being adopted, right, in either handling environmental issues or the COVID-19 crisis, it's essentially a top-down mobilizational approach, right? There's rely on extensive array of vehicles, that were installed even during the Mao era, right? But in the meantime, they also rely on this big data, informational technology, such as QR codes and cell phones to track and stop the spread of the virus. But in doing so, there's basically no input from the society, by no little, but basically like a role played by the civil society organizations. Although the society is still very cooperative, right? So that is, we can identify these parallels between the two, and even also the shortcomings, right? Because that's a campaign-based approach, it has its own problems, right? This issue of encroachment of privacy and human rights. We have heard, how, these residents, being arrested for stepping outside their homes, for not wearing masks, while, playing mahjong at home, that sort of eroded the communal trust, then we saw that the same thing, right? When China was trying to convert, converted to cleaner energy in Hebei, there's people were asked to dismantle their stoves, coal-fired stoves, but there's a shortage of natural gas, so they end up like shivering in the winter cold, so and there's also the sustainability problems, right? That they, even though you could launch these campaigns, how long this is going to last, right? We are seeing that in the COVID current government approach dealing with the COVID outbreaks, right, across the country, right? When you have, even identified even one case, that immediately we started to mobilize entire society, launching the mass testing, several million people being tested. The question is how long this is sustainable. Many of the public health experts in China now even also start to raise these questions. So I think some of the similarities can indeed be identified between the government response to the two crises.
Yeah, Yanzhong, it's interesting. I mean, when you think about it, the Chinese had a searing historical experience with SARS, right? And they had a scandal around HIV in Hunan, 2 to 4 million people, the blood transfusion networks. Years before that, they've had a variety of other scandals around vaccines and around basic medicines and the like. So there's been there was a need to. It seems to me there was a lot of learning that happened from some of those searing experiences and the scandal that led to some extraordinarily fast measures being taken that were in fact quite impactful. And that the Chinese can now sort of say to their own people, we fixed this problem and your lives are back to normal and we're back on a growth path and the like. We may not have fixed the environmental degradation problem or the human rights problems or any of these other things, but at least you're not living in North Dakota. And you're not living in a country with 230,000 cases a day and 2,500 deaths a day out into the future. Has this experience, do you think, earned President Xi some credit in standing with his own people, or has it aggravated it? How would you say? Because I think the environmental degradation, it seems to me, it's just a sort of slow, gnawing thing that just eats away, corrodes people's quality of life, their ability to protect their family and their children. It just generates all of this disappointment and lowers the lives of people. And you get revolts, but people, part of the compact is this has kind of been sold to them as this is kind of the price you pay in this sort of high growth. 4 decades. Many people reject that idea. But on the response to COVID, would you guess that the general sentiment is one that says to the government, yeah, we had to be locked down for 70 days, but we got to the other side in a successful status. What's your thinking on that?
Oh, absolutely. I think the COVID outbreak and the government response, that its ability to contain the virus spread in a very short period of time actually successfully beefed up the government legitimacy, right? If you look at the survey, the UCSD, the studies clearly shows, that the government was the people's in terms of their response, on how they would they think of the political systems they have. They are actually enthusiasm. They are about their political system has indeed significantly increased, and so is the government legitimacy, right? There's the President Xi Jinping's reputation himself. They also significantly has improved. That this is why I said in the article. In early April, I say President Xi not only modeled through the crisis, he also emerged as a winner. Politically and also at least in China. So this is similar to what the party had experienced during the SARS outbreak. So that has implications for the U.S. policy toward China, because if you look at Secretary Pompeo's speech, basically they try to separate the CCP from its people, right? They say, we want to deal with the people, we don't want to deal with CCP, but that is wrong. But if you have the party, the party has more than 90% of the support rate from, can you really separate the two, right? And the party is indeed learning. They are in a way also responding. But as far as the experience of SARS is concerned, I think that learning also is limited, right? It can vary across different cities and regions. Certainly, I think in Wuhan, the local leaders did not, draw the right lessons from the SARS outbreak. Even the Chinese media outlet Caixin reported, right, that this when the president of the hospital in Wuhan tried to convince by using the experience of SARS, trying to convince the provincial officials, that this is something big. You got to take action on it. His advice basically fell on deaf ears. So that learning indeed has a limit. And then you also even though the government has made great efforts trying to fix the loopholes in the public health systems, right? We have seen this government narratives essentially, got rid of that part, that talk about how they initially mishandled the outbreak, right? So there was no serious discussion, on the political, institutional aspects of the problem. I think if that part of the lessons being lost in the discussion, and this lessons learning experience, I think it's not bode well for the future ability to handle.
I just want to make one quick comment and then ask Jude to jump in. And the comment I wanted to make is, here in the United States, we've had this catastrophe unfold that we'll spend the next several decades trying to explain how we possibly created such a catastrophe. And was it leadership? Was it systemic weaknesses? Was it political culture? Was it lack of searing historical experience, or all of the above? And what explained this moment and this catastrophe? But we also had this discovery that we had a capacity to generate experimental platform vaccines, messenger RNA, and now others coming, the adenoviral and the inactivated, and others in record speed in the midst of a pandemic, and ready to go in 340 days or whatever it was. And that's an extraordinary discovery. And I would venture to say that while the Chinese have different ideas around what constitutes safe and effective, and they have a different norm around phase 3 trials, they're getting to that point, it seems to me, and they probably are going to have some inactivated viral vaccines that are going to be pretty good, and they're going to be valuable to the world. And they're going to make a similar argument that their science base had been transformed in the last 20 years, much like our science base. I just putting that out there. Jude, we've got a few minutes here, and you've been very patient. Wanted to make sure you weighed in on sort of your observations around the COVID response and the lessons in governance, and whether those align with what Yanzhong's laid down on the environmental degradation, or whether they depart from those.
Well, yeah, thank you. And I'll just a few quick thoughts, because Steve, I know you and I, almost a little less than a year ago, we're looking at this local isolated outbreak in central China. And I don't think we ever could have imagined where the story would go, both in terms of, I feel like I fundamentally got it wrong when thinking about how China's governance system was not reacting in and around, late January, early February. And I remember sitting next to someone at a dinner, when you used to be able to sit next to people at dinner in February, and she was at the Department of Homeland Security. And I remember asking her in February, how would the US do if this came over? And she said, fine. And it's interesting now, my takeaways both at the resiliency and competency of the US political system have diminished. And to our discussion today, my view on the adaptability and competency of the Communist Party's very sui generis type of mobilizational autocratic governance has increased insofar as how I will now think about their ability to respond to crises in the future. And so I think my kind of final thought / maybe question for Yanzhong is, as we think about the future of Chinese governance, of course, I think most of us think about success or failure of a governance model in a relative sense. We don't look at it in isolation in a laboratory. We look at it when we compare it to other political systems. It used to be the case that in the United States and other democracies, we thought, we have morality on our side because we're democratic, and we have competency on our side because our democratic institutions just function better. I think my kind of thought / question for you is, are we moving to a new possible paradigm of evaluating governance as citizens and as observers, one where we come to look at competency as being a higher weighted value than an abstract notion like freedom? We have seen in the United States an abundance of civic participation, whether that's through misinformation, disinformation, or folks like Steve, who are just trying to really help us solve this through injecting truth. But we've nonetheless seen the public square with a capital P and a capital S, and I'm not sure it's necessarily yielded optimal outcomes for the quality of discussion here. And when I look at China, I see many missing elements of what I would have thought would have yielded good governance, and yet China has returned to essentially, you can get on a plane, eat in a restaurant, and it's almost like life is normal. So, what is your view of the kind of longer term implications of what this means for how we think about Chinese governance?
Okay, well, this is the big question. I think in the post-Cold War era, right? There's some fundamental change in the landscape for global governance, right? One of the major changes is that the democracy become the fundamental principle, right, that we use to assess or evaluate whether you have good governance or whether you have bad governance. But now I think Chinese experience would, especially its experience during the COVID outbreak, right, seems to, I think, shake that funding, this validity of that funding, this fundamental principle of governance. That is especially the case in China, right? That they could easily point to, right, that this our failure in handling the COVID, the crises, and their success, but in containing the virus spread quickly, say, well, that the U.S. is now a diminishing power. Democracy is no longer, the future. That it was this kind of end of history thesis is no longer there. And that they even might pointed out how the authoritarianism, the Chinese political system, represents a viable alternative to liberal democracy. That I think is sort of a major change, right? I think in China is this kind of this governance mentality, because initially, even though they have this party state rule, still they would say in terms of rhetoric, right, we still aimed at like democracy, better participation, this is the future, right, of the country. But now I saw sort of like a major change in that mentality. I think this certainly has something to do with what we handle democracy here in this country. In a way, when we highlight the threat from the China, in a way we also actually make a straw man there, because without recognizing the real threat actually is from the democracy here in our country, which we really needs to actually renew our democracy, get our house fixed, the doctrine first. That is why I think the current this campaign, the mass vaccination campaign, sort of represents a very good opportunity for us, to show the resilience of our democracy, the ability to self-correct, and that also have profound implications of our soft power abroad.
Yanzhong, thank you so much. Jude, thank you. I think we're at the end of our hour. I would like to just ask Yanzhong to close with one, as you ponder the results of this work that you've done on environmental degradation, tell us, what are we going to be talking about with respect to China and environment in 5 years' time?
Okay, well, I think, as far as the environmental protection is concerned, and as you probably have also heard, right, that President Xi has, announced China's goal of making the country carbon neutral by 2060. I think, but if the government leaders are able to stick to that agenda, just like what they did with the population control, and using that approach of what we call the institutionalized mobilization, even with a campaign-based approach, right? If that approach is institutionalized, so that objective is doable and achievable, but in the meantime, I think without rely on rule of law, the civil society, to deal with, this environmental crisis, the climate change problem, still, well, it would face, there's the long-term challenges in terms of the sustainability, in terms of the effectiveness of their approach, especially as if we consider the potential, there's unintended, undesirable consequences on other policy fronts. The China will, certainly, well, I think we are not going to see by this collapse, of the Chinese state, in the foreseeable future. But in the meantime, I think they also has to this is going to be an uphill battle they have to fight in combating issues like environmental degradation and climate change.
Thank you. Jude, closing thought?
No, just reiterate again that I think this is one of the key books for us really to assess where China is going and its ability to implement it in a practical, real experience. So my hats off to you, Yanzhong, for writing such an excellent piece of scholarship. And as one Wall Street Journal columnist recently said, one of the key books if you want to understand Chinese foreign policy.
Thank you, Jude. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Yanzhong.
Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's event.
Thank you and congratulations. And we look forward to doing something like this again soon on these issues. So thank you so much. Thanks to our audience. Thanks to John Montz, Amith Manavili, and our other staff here at CSIS for helping us put this all together. Thank you.